Without the right tools and the proper approach, diagnosing diesel engine concerns is at best a hit-and-miss process. In this Trac Com, we'll focus on the use of one of the right tools, the 3-gauge bar. Let's begin by looking at the general diagnostic approach the gauge bar should be used with. While it's necessary to have tools such as the 3-gauge bar to troubleshoot diesel engine concerns, the right tools by themselves won't allow you to troubleshoot effectively. To do that, you'll need a step-by-step approach such as that contained in Ford New Holland's Diesel Engine Diagnosis Manual. This manual is designed to be used with the applicable tractor repair manual. Let's take a quick look at how the diagnosis manual is set up to take some of the trouble out of troubleshooting. The manual contains a description of what test equipment is needed and how tests are performed. Most of the manual, however, is devoted to a comprehensive troubleshooting procedure. The procedure begins with a preliminary checkout that should be made before testing. This checkout begins with finding out the conditions under which the tractor was operated and its maintenance history. And it includes a quick check of the tractor for any apparent defect or unusual engine noises. Following the preliminary checkout, symptom analysis and pinpoint test sections help you relate symptoms to the steps to be taken to isolate concerns. To isolate the cause of a concern, the pinpoint test charts may refer you to another section of the manual, the engine performance diagnosis procedure. The checks and tests in the procedure can be used either with the pinpoint tests or by themselves to track down the source of engine performance concerns. This is where the gauge bar, or universal pressure test kit, as it is referred to in the manual, comes into play. The gauge bar has 2 gauges that measure pressure in pounds per square inch, one from 0 to 30 psi and the other from 0 to 160 psi. Another gauge measures both pressure and vacuum in inches of water. This is also known as the magnehelic gauge. Finally, there is an air pump for conducting leak tests. A number of the steps in the engine performance diagnosis procedure involve using one of the gauges or the pump to conduct tests. At the back of the engine diagnosis manual are worksheets for recording the results of the tests and checks covered in the engine performance diagnosis procedure. In addition, the worksheets have troubleshooting steps for turbocharged tractors and figures detailing the use of test equipment. One of these worksheets is reprinted at the end of the reference manual accompanying this program. Next, we'll look at using the gauge bar to check the air induction and fuel systems on a Series 10 3-cylinder tractor. But before we do, let's try a tech question. In addition to the 3 gauges, what other piece of test equipment is part of the gauge bar? The answer is an air pump. The pump is used for testing leakage. As you follow the steps in the engine performance diagnosis procedure, the first 2 tests you'll come across, which involve using the gauge bar, are checks of air cleaner restriction and fuel pump pressure. Let's look at how these tests are run on a 3910 tractor. To begin the air cleaner restriction test, remove the restriction switch from the air cleaner outlet tube. Install a T-adapter in place of the switch. After reinstalling the switch in one side of the T, connect the other side of the T to one end of the blue-coated hose from the gauge bar kit. Connect the other end of the hose to port number 2 on the gauge bar. Port number 2 is the vacuum side of the magnehelic gauge. The other port leading to the gauge, port number 3, allows the gauge to be used for pressure readings. Never connect both sides of this gauge at the same time. One side should always be left open to atmosphere. With all the connections secure, start the engine and run the tractor at its rated speed under no load. On all Ford-built 3, 4, and 6-cylinder tractors, the reading on the gauge should not exceed 25 inches. If the reading is over 25 inches, it indicates a restriction in the air intake system, such as a dirty air filter or bent or collapsed tubing. In addition to checking for a restriction, the test setup can also be used to check the operation of the air cleaner restriction switch. With the engine once again at its rated speed, gradually restrict the air intake. The air cleaner restriction warning light should come on as the reading on the gauge reaches about 25 inches. If the light comes on when the gauge reading is substantially above or below 25 inches, the switch should be replaced. Now let's look at the next test you'll encounter in the engine performance diagnosis chart, fuel pump pressure. On a 3-cylinder tractor, that means checking the pressure of the transfer pump in the rotary injection pump. To check transfer pump pressure, first remove the bleed screw from the pump and install an adapter in its place. Be careful not to over-tighten the adapter, or you may damage the threads in the pump. Connect the adapter to one end of the red-coated hose from the gauge bar kit. Connect the other end of the hose to port number 4 on the gauge bar. This is the port which leads to the 0 to 160 psi gauge. With the gauge connected in this way, pull out the engine stop control and crank the engine to obtain a reading on the gauge. The reading should be a minimum of 5 psi. Next, start the engine and on 2810, 2910, and 3910 tractors, set engine speed at 1800 RPM. On 4610 tractors, set engine speed at 2200 RPM. Note the reading on the gauge. On 2810 tractors, it should be a minimum of 76 psi. On 2910 and 3910 tractors, the reading should be at least 60 psi. And on 4610 tractors, the reading should be at least 75 psi. Low readings during either part of the test can indicate an air leak in the fuel system. You can use the leak testing procedure described later in this program to find out if this is the case. If there is no evidence of leaks, it indicates a transfer pump that is not doing its job. The pump should be returned to an authorized Lucas CAV repair station so that it can be inspected for damage or wear. Next, we need to look at how the gauge bar can be used to check fuel pump pressure on inline pump systems. But first, let's try a tech question. When using the magnehelic gauge, always leave one side of the gauge open to atmosphere. True or false? The answer is true. Never connect both sides of the magnehelic gauge at the same time. On tractors with an inline injection pump, such as this TW15, you can use the gauge bar to check lift pump performance. Lift pump testing has two parts, a check of static pressure and a check at rated speed. To check the lift pump static pressure using the gauge bar, first shut off the fuel supply. Then remove the line to the filter from the lift pump outlet and install one end of a T-line from the gauge bar kit to the outlet fitting. Close off the other end of the T-line with an adapter and cap. Connect one end of the red-coated hose from the gauge bar kit to the open end of the T-line. Connect the other end of the hose to port number 1 on the gauge bar. Port number 1 leads to the 0 to 30 psi pressure gauge. After turning the fuel supply back on, operate the priming lever on the lift pump until the reading of the pressure gauge stops rising. To obtain the highest static reading during this test, it may be necessary to crank the engine with the engine stop control pulled out. No matter what the method used, you should be able to obtain a minimum pressure reading of 2.5 psi, and the reading should hold for at least 5 minutes. To check the lift pump performance at rated speed, first turn the fuel supply off once again. Next, remove the cap from the end of the T-line and connect the line's fitting to the fuel filter inlet. The other end of the T-line should remain connected to the lift pump outlet, and the gauge should remain connected to the T. After turning the fuel supply back on, start the engine and set the RPM to the rated speed. At this point, the pressure gauge should register a minimum of 4 psi. If the readings during the static test or at rated speed are low, the fuel filters may be plugged, or the lift pump may need to be repaired or replaced. Before replacing a lift pump or transfer pump, however, you need to make sure that low readings are not the result of an air leak. The air pump on a gauge bar can pressurize the fuel lines and help you locate air leaks. Let's look at conducting the test on a tractor with a rotary injection pump. First, drain the fuel from the fuel filter and disconnect the fuel line at the fuel filter inlet. Next, attach a jumper line from the number 1 port on the gauge bar to one of the 2 ports to the left of number 1. This jumper line will allow the gauge to register the pressure created by the air pump. Connect the female end of the T-line from the gauge bar kit to the fuel filter inlet. Close off the other end of the T-line using an adapter and a cap. To complete the hookup, connect one end of the gauge bar's blue-coated hose to the T of the T-line and the other end of the hose to the remaining fitting to the left of port number 1 on the gauge bar. If the fuel injection pump is equipped with a leak-off line, you'll need to plug the line or the line's fitting before leak testing the fuel system. To do this, you can use a threaded plug at the injection pump, or you can install a plug in the leak-off line from the rearmost injector. With the connections secure, use the pump to pressurize the system to 15 psi and operate the pump as necessary to maintain the pressure. Apply a soapy water solution to areas where leaks have the greatest chance of developing, such as near fittings. The formation of bubbles indicates a leak. Most of the time, simply tightening a fitting or component will stop the leak. You can use the same procedure to leak test tractors with inline injection pumps. Now let's turn from leak testing to testing of a different sort, a tech question. Which gauge on the gauge bar is used to check inline pump pressure? The answer is the 0 to 30 psi gauge. Besides inline pump pressure, this gauge is also used in the check of fuel system leakage. We've looked at using the gauge bar to check the air induction and fuel systems. Well, the gauge bar can check conditions within the engine as well. Oil pressure, the amount of crankcase pressure, and the amount of turbo boost in the intake manifold. Let's look at performing these tests on a TW15 tractor. To check engine oil pressure, first remove the oil pressure sender from the left side of the engine block and install a T adapter in its place. Install the sender in one of the ports on the T. Install one end of the red-coated hose from the gauge bar kit to the remaining port on the T adapter. Connect the other end of the hose to port number 4 on the gauge bar. This is the port which leads to the 0 to 160 psi gauge. On 3 and 4 cylinder tractors, the red-coated hose is installed on an adapter in the port on the oil pump drive gear housing. For further details about connecting the gauge in this manner, see the reference manual accompanying this program. With the connections secure, start the tractor engine, allow it to idle, and observe the gauge. All engines should register a minimum of 10 psi oil pressure at idle. After allowing the engine to warm up, set the engine to its rated speed. In the case of this TW15, that's 2200 RPM. 3 and 4 cylinder engines should produce from 35 to 60 psi at rated speed. 6 cylinder engines should register between 40 and 65 psi at rated speed. Besides being a check of engine oil pressure, the engine oil pressure test can serve as a check of the oil pressure sending circuit. Oil pressure warning lamp illumination or low oil pressure gauge readings on the instrument panel need to be verified by low oil pressure readings on the gauge bar. On this TW series tractor, the air cleaner restriction warning lamp also serves as the oil pressure warning lamp. If the engine oil pressure proves to be low, the engine performance diagnosis procedure will refer you to a pinpoint test to help you isolate the cause. Another check of conditions within the engine is crankcase pressure. Crankcase pressure can indicate the amount of blow-by past the piston rings. To check crankcase pressure, first remove the engine oil dipstick and install the adapter from the gauge bar kit in the tube. Connect one end of the blue-coated hose from the gauge bar kit to the adapter. Connect the other end of the hose to port number 3 on the gauge bar. Port number 3 is the pressure port leading to the magnehelic gauge. Be sure to leave the vacuum port to this gauge open to atmosphere while checking crankcase pressure. With the test equipment connections secure, start the engine and allow it to warm up. Once the engine is at operating temperature, set the engine to its rated speed. The magnehelic gauge should read no more than 4.5 inches with the tractor at its rated speed. If the gauge reading is higher than 4.5 inches, an engine compression check is in order. It will determine whether worn rings or cylinders are causing excessive blow-by. On tractors equipped with turbochargers, the same condition that results from worn rings and cylinders, lack of power, can be caused by low or no turbo boost. For this reason, the final test in the engine performance diagnosis procedure is a check of intake manifold pressure, or turbo boost. To begin the check, remove the plug from the intake manifold and install an adapter in its place. Next, connect one end of the red-coated hose from the gauge bar test kit to the adapter. Connect the other end to port number 1 on the gauge bar. This is the port which leads to the 0 to 30 psi pressure gauge. Next, attach a PTO dynamometer to the tractor. The dynamometer allows the turbocharger to develop maximum boost. After warming the engine to normal operating temperature, adjust the engine and dynamometer controls so that the engine is at rated speed under a full load. Observe the reading on the 0 to 30 psi gauge. On 4-cylinder engines, the gauge should read between 12 and 16 psi. On 6-cylinder engines, the gauge should read between 15 and 19 psi. When boost readings are below these ranges, check the air intake and exhaust systems for restrictions. If these seem to be in good condition, the worksheets at the back of the diagnosis manual and in the Trac Com reference manual can prove to be a valuable aid to further troubleshooting. Part of the worksheet is a turbocharger diagnosis section. The section details the checks to be made when the turbocharger may be the cause of a low power complaint. Trac Com 10 turbochargers can provide you with additional information on turbocharger diagnosis and operation. And our next tech question can provide you with an opportunity to check your knowledge. It concerns crankcase pressure. At what engine speed is crankcase pressure checked? At the rated speed of the engine. The maximum acceptable amount of crankcase pressure is 4.5 inches, as indicated by the magnehelic gauge. Well, that about wraps up this Trac Com. As we have seen, diagnosing diesel engine performance is a task that requires the right tools and the right approach. The gauge bar is one of these tools. When you use it with procedures such as those found in the diesel engine diagnosis manual, you're much more likely to hit than miss the cause of a diesel engine concern.